2,000 years ago, this was the edge of the known world. A cold, grey, rain-soaked island, half lost in fog at the far northern rim of the map. To the mighty Roman Empire, it was almost the end of the earth itself. A damp, savage place at the boundary of civilization. And yet, this small, muddy island would one day rule a quarter of the entire planet. Its language would become the language of the world. Its laws, its sports, its very way of thinking would spread to every continent on Earth. How? How did a tiny island on the edge of nowhere end up at the very center of everything? This is the entire history of Britain, from a forgotten Roman outpost through invasions and crowns and a king who lost far more than his throne, to the largest empire the world has ever known, and its slow, dramatic fall. It is a story of conquest and rebellion, of brilliant rulers and disastrous ones, of an island that was invaded again and again, until it became the invader. Let's begin at the very beginning, when Britain wasn't even called Britain. Long before there was an England, there was a wild, forested island inhabited by tribes we now call the Celts. They farmed, they traded, and they had no idea that the most powerful force on earth was about to take notice of them. In 55 BC, the famous Roman general Julius Caesar sailed across the Channel and set foot on the island. It was less an invasion than a probe. He came, he looked around, and he left. But Rome had seen Britain now, and Rome rarely forgot a prize. Nearly a century later, in 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius sent a true force across the water, and this time they stayed. Rome conquered the south of the island and gave it a name, Britannia. For almost 400 years, Britain was Roman. The Romans built straight roads that still shape the country today. They built towns, baths, and a great city on the River Thames they called Londinium, the city we now know as London. They brought wine, writing, and order. But they never conquered all of it. Far to the north, in what is now Scotland, fierce tribes refused to bow. And so, around 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian did something extraordinary. He ordered a vast stone wall built right across the island, from coast to coast, to mark the edge of the Roman world. Hadrian's wall still stands today, a line in the land that says, "Beyond this point, even Rome would not go." Not everyone accepted Roman rule quietly. The most famous to rise against them was Boudica, a warrior queen of a British tribe who led a massive uprising, burning Roman towns, including London itself, to the ground. She came terrifyingly close to driving Rome off the island entirely, before she was finally defeated. But by the early 400s AD, Rome itself was crumbling. Threatened on every side, the empire pulled its soldiers out of Britain to defend its heartland. In 410 AD, the Romans effectively told the Britons they were on their own. And just like that, after 4 centuries, Rome was gone. The roads remained, the ruins remained, but the protection vanished overnight, which left one terrifying question hanging over the island. With the most powerful army in the world gone, who would come next? The answer came from across the sea, in wooden boats. With the Romans gone, new peoples sailed to Britain from what is now Germany and Denmark. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Some came to raid. Many came to stay. Over the following centuries, they spread across the land, pushing the native Britons west into Wales and Cornwall. These newcomers, the Anglo-Saxons, reshaped everything. They brought their own language, the root of the English we speak today. And from the Angles came the name that would define the island forever: the land of the Angles. Angleland. England. Early England was not one country, but a patchwork of small rival kingdoms, each with its own king, constantly competing for power. And then, once again, the sea brought trouble. In the late 700s, terrifying raiders appeared from the north: the Vikings. Fast, fearless seafarers from Scandinavia, they struck coastal towns and monasteries, then pushed deeper inland, seizing huge stretches of England and settling there. It seemed only a matter of time before all of England fell under their control. It came down to one kingdom and one king: Alfred, ruler of Wessex, the only English king ever to be called the Great. When the Vikings nearly overran him, Alfred didn't surrender. He retreated into the marshes, regrouped, and came back to win a decisive victory that saved his kingdom. He then made a deal that split England in two, part Saxon, part Viking, and used the peace to build schools, laws, and defences. It was Alfred's descendants who finished what he started, slowly uniting the separate kingdoms until, for the first time in history, there was a single King of England. But unity is fragile. England was now a rich and tempting prize, a single crown, a single throne. And across the Channel, in a region of France called Normandy, a powerful duke was watching closely and beginning to believe that crown should be his. His name would become the most famous in all of English history, and the year he made his move, 1066, would change the island forever. 1066 is the single most important date in English history. Every schoolchild in Britain knows it, and the reason is a man named William, Duke of Normandy. When the English king died at the start of 1066 with no clear heir, three powerful men claimed the throne. One was an English nobleman named Harold, who was crowned king. Another was a Norwegian king who invaded from the north. And the third was William of Normandy, who was convinced the crown had been promised to him. What followed was one of the most dramatic years in history. First, King Harold marched north and defeated the Norwegian invasion in a stunning victory. But the celebration didn't last. Almost immediately, word arrived that William had landed in the south with a Norman army. Exhausted, Harold force-marched his men the length of England to meet him. The two sides met near a town called Hastings. The clash lasted all day, hanging back and forth, until late in the afternoon, King Harold fell, and the English line collapsed. William of Normandy had won. On Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned King of England. History would remember him as William the Conqueror, and conquer he did. William seized the land of the English nobility and handed it to his Norman followers. He built towering stone castles across the country to control the population, including a mighty fortress in London that still stands today, the Tower of London. He even ordered a complete survey of everything in England, every village, every field, every cow, recorded in a famous book so thorough that people grimly compared it to the final judgment. The Norman conquest didn't just change who sat on the throne, it changed the language, mixing French into English. It changed the laws, the architecture, the ruling class. everything. The England that emerged was a new country. But William's conquest planted a seed that would grow into centuries of trouble. Because England's kings were now also French nobles, with lands and claims across the Channel. And that tangled web of loyalty and ambition would soon drag England into the longest, bitterest rivalry of the entire Middle Ages, with France. The centuries after 1066 were the age of the medieval kings, a turbulent time of powerful, ambitious rulers and the long, slow birth of the rights we take for granted today. One king stands out for a single, world-changing reason. His name was John, and he is usually remembered as one of England's worst kings. He lost most of England's lands in France, he taxed his barons mercilessly, and he ruled so badly that his own nobles finally rose up against him. In 1215, they forced King John to a meadow called Runnymede and made him put his seal to a document, a list of promises limiting the king's power and protecting certain rights. It was called Magna Carta, the Great Charter. At the time, it was simply a peace deal between an angry king and his barons, but the idea behind it, that even a king is not above the law, would echo for centuries and help shape democracies around the world. This was also the age of legends, of knights and castles, of the supposed tales of Robin Hood, of grand cathedrals rising across the land. But it was also an age of suffering. In the 1340s, a catastrophe arrived from the east, a terrible plague that became known as the Black Death. In just a few years, it is thought to have taken the lives of nearly half the people in England. Whole villages vanished. It was the single greatest disaster the island had ever known. And running through it all was the great rivalry of the age, England versus France. Because of those tangled claims dating back to the conquest, English kings believed they had a right to the French throne itself. The result was a struggle so long, it earned an almost unbelievable name: the 100 Years' War. For over a century, on and off, England and France clashed across the Channel. There were legendary English triumphs, like Agincourt, where a small, tired English army stunned a far larger French force. And there were French heroes who turned the tide. Above all, a teenage girl named Joan of Arc, who inspired France to fight back and helped drive the English out for good. In the end, after more than 100 years, England lost almost everything it had fought for in France. The dream of a French crown was over. And worse was coming. The noble families of England, defeated abroad and hungry for power at home, now turned on each other. The crown itself became the prize, and England was about to tear itself apart from within. With the long struggle against France finally over, England's most powerful families turned their ambition inward. Two great branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, both believed they had the better claim to the throne. The result was a series of internal conflicts that later became known as the Wars of the Roses, named for the symbols of the two sides: a red rose for Lancaster, a white rose for York. For 30 years, the crown changed hands again and again as the two families struggled for control. Kings rose and fell. Loyalties shifted overnight. It was one of the most unstable periods in English history. It finally ended in 1485, when an outsider with a distant claim named Henry Tudor defeated the reigning king and took the throne. To unite the exhausted country, he married a princess of the rival house, joining red rose and white into a single symbol. the Tudor rose. The bitter rivalry was over, and so began the most famous dynasty in English history, the Tudors. The most notorious Tudor of all was his son, King Henry VIII. He is remembered for one staggering fact. He had 6 wives. He set them aside, divorced them, and lost them one after another in his desperate quest for a male heir. But Henry's wives led to something far bigger than royal scandal. When the Pope refused to let Henry end his first marriage, Henry did the unthinkable. He broke England away from the Catholic Church in Rome entirely and declared himself the head of a new Church of England. In one decision, he changed the religion of the entire nation, a split from Rome that would shape Britain for centuries. After Henry came a struggle over religion. And then, in 1558, his daughter took the throne and became perhaps the greatest ruler England ever had, Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth's reign was a golden age. It was the time of William Shakespeare, the greatest writer in the English language. It was the age of bold sea captains who sailed around the globe. And it was the age when tiny England faced down the most powerful empire on earth, Spain. When the enormous Spanish Armada sailed to conquer the island and was scattered and broken by English ships and ferocious storms. England had survived. England was rising. But Elizabeth died without children, and the Tudor line died with her. The crown now passed to her distant cousin, the King of Scotland, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under one man for the very first time. And that union of 2 proud, rival nations would soon lead England into the most shocking event in its entire history. The day the people put their own king on trial. When the King of Scotland inherited the English throne, he ruled both nations at once. But his son, King Charles I, believed something dangerous, that a king answered to no one but God. Not to the people, not to Parliament, to no one. Parliament, the assembly that represented the nobles and the people, strongly disagreed. The 2 sides clashed over money, over religion, and above all, over a single question that had haunted England since Magna Carta. Who truly holds the power, the king or the people? Neither side would back down. And in the 1640s, the unthinkable happened. The country split in 2, and king and parliament went to open conflict against each other. This was the English Civil War. On one side stood the supporters of the king. On the other stood the forces of Parliament, led by a stern, brilliant, deeply religious commander named Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell built a disciplined new army, and over years of struggle, Parliament's forces won. King Charles I was captured. And then came the moment that stunned all of Europe. Parliament did something no one had ever dared to do. They put their own king on trial, found him guilty, and in 1649 they ended his reign and his life. For the first and only time in its history, England had no king at all. For a decade, England became a republic, ruled by Cromwell. But ruling without a king proved harder than removing one. Cromwell's rule grew strict and unpopular, and after he died, the country was exhausted by the experiment. In 1660, England simply invited the old king's son to come back and take the throne. The monarchy returned. But everything had changed. The idea that a king ruled by divine right, answerable to no one, was finished forever. Power was shifting, slowly, permanently, away from the throne and toward Parliament. When a later king again tried to rule like a tyrant, Parliament removed him too, this time peacefully, in what became known as the Glorious Revolution, and laid down clear limits on what a monarch could do. England had answered its oldest question. The people, through Parliament, would hold the real power. And a nation with that kind of stability, that kind of confidence, was about to turn its eyes outward, to the sea and to the world beyond it. By the early 1700s, England and Scotland had shared the same monarch for a century, but they were still two separate countries with two separate parliaments and a long history of rivalry between them. In 1707, that changed. The two kingdoms agreed to join together formally into a single united nation. England and Scotland, later joined fully by Wales and Ireland, became one country with one parliament. And it took a new name, the name that would soon be known across the entire globe: Great Britain. This new Britain was something special. It had a stable government where Parliament, not the monarch, held the power. It had a growing fleet of merchant ships and the most powerful navy on earth. It had banks, trade, and ambition, and it sat on the edge of an ocean that led to the entire world. Britain began planting colonies and trading posts across the globe, in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in India. British ships carried goods, settlers, and influence to every corner of the map. The nation was growing rich and growing bold. It was not all triumph. Britain's wealth in this era was built in part on a dark foundation: the transatlantic slave trade, which carried enormous human suffering and remains one of the most shameful chapters in the nation's history. And Britain's ambitions sparked rivalries with other powers, above all its old enemy, France, leading to conflicts fought not just in Europe, but around the entire world. One of those conflicts changed the map of the planet. By defeating France in a global struggle, Britain seized vast territories, including control of Canada and a dominant position in India. But that same global ambition led to one of Britain's most famous failures. Across the Atlantic, its 13 American colonies grew tired of being taxed and ruled from a distant island. In 1776, they declared their independence, and after a long struggle, they won it, becoming the United States of America. Britain had lost the jewel of its early empire. It was a humiliating blow. Many believed it was the beginning of the end for Britain. They could not have been more wrong, because at that very moment, in the workshops and coal fields of northern England, something was beginning that would make Britain more powerful than any nation in human history. A revolution, not of armies, but of machines. In the late 1700s, in the factories and mines of Britain, the modern world was being born. It was called the Industrial Revolution, and it began right here on this small island. Britain learned to harness coal and steam to power machines. Goods that once took weeks to make by hand could now be produced in vast quantities in enormous factories. Steam engines drove ships, and soon railways. Iron roads that connected the country at speeds no one had ever imagined. Cities exploded in size as people poured in to work. Britain became the workshop of the world, producing a staggering share of everything the planet made. This industrial power, combined with the world's strongest navy, turned Britain into a global superpower without equal. And under the long reign of Queen Victoria in the 1800s, the British Empire reached its astonishing peak. At its height, the British Empire ruled around a quarter of the world's land and a quarter of its people. It controlled India, the jewel in the crown, along with vast territories in Africa, Australia, Canada, and countless islands and ports across every ocean. The sun was always shining on some part of it, which gave rise to the famous phrase, "The empire on which the sun never sets." British power shaped the entire globe. The English language spread to every continent. British sports, football, cricket, rugby were exported worldwide. British ideas about law, government, and trade reached billions of people. For a time, this one small island sat at the absolute center of the world. But an empire that size carried deep contradictions. It brought railways, schools, and trade to some regions, but it also brought conquest, exploitation, and suffering to millions who had never asked to be ruled. The same empire that called itself a force for progress also crushed rebellions and drained the wealth of the lands it controlled. Its legacy to this day is fiercely debated, a story of both extraordinary achievement and profound injustice. At the dawn of the 20th century, Britain stood at the summit of the world. It seemed untouchable, eternal, the greatest power the earth had ever seen. And yet, within just 50 years, almost all of it would be gone. Because the new century was about to bring two catastrophes so enormous they would shatter the old world completely and bring the age of empires crashing down. The 20th century tested Britain like nothing before it. In 1914, Europe collapsed into the First World War, a vast, grinding conflict that pulled in nations from across the globe. Britain and its empire were drawn in, and an entire generation of young men was lost in the trenches of Europe. The nation won alongside its allies, but at a terrible cost. The Britain that emerged was exhausted, deep in debt, and quietly weakened. Then, just 2 decades later, came an even greater test. In 1939, the Second World War began, and within a year, Britain found itself standing almost completely alone against the seemingly unstoppable forces of Nazi Germany, which had conquered most of Europe. This was Britain's most legendary hour. Under the defiant leadership of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the island refused to surrender. In the skies above southern England, British pilots fought off relentless air attacks in what became known as the Battle of Britain, a desperate defense that saved the nation. Through years of hardship, bombing, and sacrifice, Britain held on, until, with its allies, above all the United States and the Soviet Union, it finally prevailed. Britain had stood firm. It was, in many ways, the island's finest moment. But victory came at a staggering price. The nation was financially ruined, its cities scarred, its global power broken. The age when Britain could dominate the world was over. And so, in the years after the war, the great empire began to dissolve. One by one, the territories Britain had ruled claimed their independence. India, the jewel in the crown, became free in 1947. Across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, nation after nation raised its own flag. Within a single generation, the largest empire in human history had peacefully unwound itself, leaving behind a scattering of independent countries and a common language that still links them today. Britain had gone from ruling a quarter of the planet to being, once again, a single island off the coast of Europe. The empire was gone. But the story was not over, because Britain now faced a new and very different challenge. Figuring out who it was and what it would be in a world it no longer ruled. The Britain that emerged from the 20th century was a changed nation, learning to live in a world it had once commanded. At home, it built something new. In the years after the war, Britain created a welfare state and a national health service, free healthcare for every citizen, an idea that became a deep source of national pride. The country rebuilt its bombed cities and slowly grew prosperous again. It also transformed in culture. In the 1960s, Britain conquered the world all over again, not with ships or soldiers, but with music and style. The Beatles and a wave of British bands captured the entire planet. London became one of the cultural capitals of the world. A small island that had lost its empire found a new kind of global influence through its creativity. Britain also became a far more diverse nation, as people from across the former empire came to live and work on the island, reshaping its cities, its food, and its identity into something new. The country wrestled, too, with its place in the world. It joined its European neighbours in the project that became the European Union, and then, decades later, in a deeply divisive vote known as Brexit, chose to leave again, sparking debates about identity and independence that continue to this day. The ancient nations within Britain, especially Scotland, also questioned whether they should remain united at all. Today, Britain is no longer the centre of the world. It is a medium-sized island nation, wrestling with its history, proud of its achievements, and honest, increasingly, about its darker chapters. And yet, look at what this island did. It was once the cold, forgotten edge of the Roman world, a damp, foggy outpost at the boundary of the map. From that unlikely beginning, it was invaded, conquered, and torn apart again and again. And every time, it rebuilt itself, until it gave the world a language, a model of government, an industrial revolution, and an empire unlike any other. The story of Britain is the story of a small island that refused to stay small. And whatever comes next, its fingerprints are on the entire modern world. If you enjoyed this journey through the entire history of Britain, you'll love our deep dive into the history of its oldest rival, France, and the dynasty that once ruled half of Europe, the Habsburgs. Both are on screen now. Subscribe, and we'll keep uncovering the great stories of history, one nation at a time. Thank you for watching.